So the British government is basically negotiating on our behalf, on the family's behalf. There has been precedents before with the French, with the Americans, political prisoners in Egypt, that their other government would negotiate their release, and they would be like extradited, deported to their other country of residence. Technically as criminals, but of course when they go to the other country they're not regarded as criminals, and that's what we're pushing the British government to do, to negotiate for Alaa's release, to basically say we want our citizen. What's happening is that the Egyptian authorities are very reluctant, and they're not even allowing the British embassy to visit Alaa in prison. They're not allowing them consular access, and now they're just bluntly saying that we don't acknowledge Alaa's British citizenship because he hasn't, he didn't take the Egyptian authorities' permission to apply for British citizenship. So the Egyptian authorities are escalating, and the British are not pushing back.
And what does this change of prime minister mean for you? I mean, I assume that people are racing past you up and down the stairs of the British Foreign Office, not covering you, but covering what's going on with Liz Truss resigning. What role did they play in granting him citizenship, and what does this mean? Is this a setback, or will it help?
The people I'm sitting to be a reminder for are actually civil servants, so my sitting still is valid. But of course, the instability, and it's been since also like the last day of Boris, the instability makes the Egyptian authorities kind of don't take you as seriously. What happened to the British pound was like in negotiations and IMF negotiations, we heard that the Egyptian officials were saying like we're making fun of the British pound, so it doesn't help Britain's image in the world in general. But the people I'm trying to put pressure on are still in office, and they're mainly the civil servants who prepare the paperwork and who give the advice for whoever will be minister. So it's still valid.
And members of parliament like David Lammy have joined you at your sit-in. Now, I wanted to ask about Alaa's health. 200 days on hunger strike and where he's being held. How is he?
So Alaa has been living on 100 calories a day, so his body took time, the 100 calories of liquid, basically honey on his tea or skimmed milk. So the degradation, it was slow, but last I saw him was in August, and he already looked very weak. My mom saw him recently because she's in Cairo. She said he basically looks like he looks like a skeleton. He looks like skin on bones. His mind is still alert. He feels better than he looks, and he says that he thinks he can endure more. But he looks really scary, and we're not sure how much time is left. We're not sure his body can take how much longer, and the prison authority, the prison administration, will not acknowledge Alaa's hunger strike, so they don't do any medical checkups or any of that. They even sent like a fraudulent medical report to the British embassy in July, dated on a date where Alaa wasn't checked, and so I'm really worried that when, because it's inevitable, sooner or later it will happen, and it's probably very soon when Alaa's body collapses. I'm not sure if they will act urgently. But the thing that I always remind myself of and to calm myself is that there is a camera 24/7 in Alaa's cell. Of course, that's a bad thing for any normal inmate, but in our case, this should mean that Alaa is under supervision. But yeah, the situation is desperate.
Sana, I want to bring in Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein is senior contributing writer at The Intercept, professor of climate justice at the University of British Columbia. Naomi, you wrote a piece in The Intercept and The Guardian, Greenwashing a Police State, the Truth Behind Egypt's COP27 Masquerade. You point out that for the tens of thousands of people that will be at the climate summit in Sharm el-Sheikh, Democracy Now!, of course, will be covering it and will be there. That number may well be less than the number of political prisoners in Egypt's jails. Can you talk more about this?
Hi, Amy. Good to be with you, and hi, Sana. I think that number is really important because you hear these figures thrown around, and it's hard to wrap your head around it. But as you know, Amy, from covering COPs now for more than a decade, they really are kind of like a city within a city. They're huge. There's going to be around more than 35,000 delegates, and this is a combination of government negotiators and activists and NGOs, envoys of all kinds, and a few world leaders mixed in, environment ministers the world over. So it will just be very, very large, but that will be about half the number of estimated political prisoners in Egypt, which is estimated to be around 60,000. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty groups that are following this will be quick to say that because of the total lack of transparency, it's very, very hard to know whether it could be many, many more. So this is the political context. The pieces that you mentioned I'm arguing that this really crosses a new red line. There's often repression during COPs, there's often arrests, but the stakes of those arrests are completely different in Egypt. But more than that, this is a country, the most repressive regime in modern Egyptian history, that is at active war with the very idea of civil society. And civil society is a key partner, is a key element in these climate summits. It's not like holding the Olympics or the World Cup. I mean, this activism, research, freedom of speech, it's absolutely integral to the negotiations themselves. And there's going to be this extraordinary cognitive dissonance when people go to Egypt it's less than 2 weeks now, because there'll be a sort of a show that's going on in Sharm el-Sheikh. There will be some members of Egyptian civil society, there will be youth leaders, there will be people holding signs and seemingly free to say things, but it will be extremely kind of scripted and constrained, because the Egyptian groups that have been allowed into that space, they have overwhelmingly been vetted by the Egyptian government. And according to Human Rights Watch's research, there are certain kinds of environmental issues that are considered sort of welcome, is the word that they use, topics. And those are things like recycling, picking up litter, advocating for solar panels, advocating for climate finance that would enrich this regime. But what is not welcome would be pointing out the enormous lucrative network of deals that the military itself is engaged in that are linked to fossil fuels, that are linked to destroying remaining green space in cities like Cairo, that are building coal-powered cement plants and so on. None of that is welcome. And indeed, even just doing the research to say what is going on in Egypt could land you with a death sentence under the current regime.
I was looking at a retweet of yours. You retweeted Jillian Keegan, who said, "Young voices need to be heard. This morning I met with Egyptian youth climate leaders, amazing people with inspiring ideas. At COP27, we must remember the energy and passion of young people and ensure it drives us forward." And you retweeted it with this comment: "This is exactly the greenwash, rights wash El-Sisi wants out of COP27 while thousands of young activists suffer in the torture chambers. What an absolute disgrace. Hashtag free Allah." Talk more about this and the connection of the issue of human rights to climate activism, and who won't be at the summit, not because they're thousands of miles away, that's another issue, but Egyptian activists.
Sure. And Sana can speak about this much better than I. But that was a British. I believe she's the envoy for Africa. Under I don't know what her position is today because of course the British government is in complete collapse. Um, and I didn't mean any disrespect to the young climate leaders who are having their picture taken with her, but this is the kind of photo op that is being staged by El-Sisi. I think that young activists are being put in an absolutely untenable position inside Egypt and outside Egypt. They didn't choose for this summit to be in Egypt. That was a decision, and I think a terrible one made by the UNFCCC Secretariat, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. You know, holding a COP, holding this huge summit, it's a big economic boon for a country, it's a big PR boon for a country. There should be conditions attached to it. There should be some minimum human rights criteria that for any country that is going to be hosting a COP. And obviously, Egypt would not meet that. But so the irony, you know, Sana is with us. Sana is a hero in her own right. Sana, you know, was one of the young people who took Tahrir Square in 2011 and were the toast of the world, right? I mean, Democracy Now! Was covering it wall to wall, so was CNN, so was The Daily Show. They were the great hope, the Arab Spring. So that was just 17 at the time. There were 14-year-olds in the square. And so the irony of this regime holding up their youth leaders and and saying that they're going to be speaking, and this is a direct quote from the COP website, that they will be speaking truth to power in Egypt, while thousands upon thousands of young people are in El-Sisi's torture chambers, is just a kind of, it is Orwellian in the dissonance. In some of the letters from prison, he talks about how some of his cellmates are just 17 themselves and have been in prison since they were kids.
I wanted
So
to...
I think just one thing I would add is that yesterday Greta Thunberg tweeted in solidarity with Egypt's prisoners of conscience and you know, said use the hashtag #FreeThemAll, which I think is really a very profound act and statement of solidarity from one youth leader to others behind bars.
I want to end with Sana, but first I want to play the words of Alaa Abdel Fattah in his own words.
All that's asked of us is that we insist on standing up for what's right. We're not required to be victorious in our stand for what's right. We're not required to be strong as we stand for what's right. We're not required to be rehearsed in our stand for what's right. We're to have a good plan or good organization. All that's asked of us is that we insist on standing up for what's right.
That from Alaa's father's memorial in 2014. Briefly released to be able to attend. I know this is very painful for you, Sana, as you talk about your brother, more than 200 days on hunger strike. Your dad died in 2014. His son was born, is that right, when he was in prison earlier?
Yeah.
Your final thoughts
Well, thank
as
you
you
both
head
for-
back to the sit-in.
Yeah, I wanted to stress on what Naomi was saying, that it's really important to use this event to shed light on the human rights situation in Egypt. The repercussions are going to happen anyway, that cannot be saved, unfortunately, but they can be less. Right now, the repercussions are starting to happen. Police forces have started around in several neighborhoods in the city of Cairo, in the capital, have started stopping people in the street and checking their mobile phones to see like what they write on Facebook. We usually have this. They do this around the anniversary of the revolution, and that's a month where everybody who was part of the revolution would wipe their phones, would stay in a different address. Everybody believes that this oppressive technique has started early this year because COP is happening in Egypt. So I just want to urge anybody going to keep that in mind, that people in Egypt are going to pay a very heavy price for that event. And so it's really important to be critical, and it's really important to speak up. And I'm really thankful to everybody doing that, like Naomi and Greta, because first, it could ease the repercussions. Secondly, while we face those repercussions, we should at least feel the warmth of solidarity. And as collectively, all of us around the planet, we could create. It could be a good lesson learned for the future climate conferences that there are requirements for the host country, so that the next years there are no other countries that are basically sacrifice zones. The next year COP will be in UAE, which will be a much bigger challenge. So it's really important to shed light on the human rights situation in Egypt now.
Going to lose this war. And anyone who says Ukraine is winning, they don't know anything about the war. They don't read maps. If you check the map of the control over Ukraine, you know how Russia is grabbing the land in order to turn Ukraine into an inland. So it will deprive Ukraine from its geopolitical importance. Russia doesn't need to occupy Ukraine. They just need to occupy from Donetsk, the Donbass region, okay, all to Mariupol and all the way to Odessa. Just the belt. And when they do that, Ukraine is irrelevant.
Welcome to Redacted Conversations. I'm Clayton Morris. On this show, we invite whistleblowers, journalists, and interesting people to share their stories. As human beings, we always look for connections. We're always looking to connect the dots. It's what we do, it's in our DNA. And sometimes these connections are hidden from the public because of propaganda and lies driven by Western media and intelligence organizations. In the great conflicts of the world right now, there are a lot of connections that they hope you won't notice in Ukraine, in Syria, and beyond. Well, someone who's been shedding light on this is my guest today. His name is Kevork Almasi, and he's an independent journalist covering geopolitics with a special focus on Syria and Armenia. He runs the independent YouTube channel called Syrian Analysis. I encourage you to check it out. And just like this channel, he doesn't get any funding from billionaire corporations that tell him what to say, what to produce, what videos to put out. And that's how he manages to actually report truth on the major issues of our time. Kevork, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Clayton. It's a really pleasure.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have you. Can you give our audience a little background, where you are in the world, and how did you decide to get into this racket like the rest of us?
First of all, I was born and raised in Syria. I'm Syrian, but I have an Armenian origin, so my grandparents survived the Armenian genocide 3 generations ago, and they found a shelter in Syria, so I was born in Syria. And since my childhood, I grew up in a very politicized environment, let's say, because of the genocide that all the grandparents start telling their grandchildren. And later, because of the situation in the Middle East, especially with the invasion of Iraq, I was pretty much touched by what happened in Iraq, although I was just a kid. And back then Syria had really bad relations with Saddam Hussein, but despite that we were all against the war, because we know this was not about Saddam Hussein, this was about destroying Iraq and turning it into a failed state. And we knew that destroying a country like Iraq with a rich civilization, which can project its cultural and civil, let's say, leverage over the region, will have its impact also on Syria, because Syria also has a similar, let's say, social fabric. And we knew that after the fall of Iraq, the turn is coming for Syria. It wasn't like a conspiracy theory, it was the United States saying that we're coming for you. You have to follow our instructions. It was Colin Powell in Syria after the fall of Saddam Hussein that he told President Bashar Assad that you have to follow these steps. If not, it's your turn. So we understood the message since then, but we didn't expect that the war could come on Syria from a non-conventional method like this one. We expected an invasion by the United States, maybe we expected an invasion by Israel, but like a 4th generation of asymmetrical warfare that the CIA waged in Syria was very new for the Syrians and also for the Syrian government. In my observation, they were very bad in handling the crisis from the beginning. They didn't master any of the skills that the United States has in terms of propaganda warfare, in terms of creating public opinions in Syria based on media narratives. For example, there are people who still believe until this moment, like I'm a Syrian and they're Syrians, but I was the one who from the beginning I was capturing lots of videos online, saving them for later. They still believe there were, for example, mass graves, there were chemical attacks, and these are also Syrians. But their narratives or their understanding of the conflict was basically based on what few media channels were feeding them. Especially on top of them is Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera played a very destructive role in Syria, and they injected so much sectarianism, hatred, social hatred, sectarian hatred, religious hatred, into extent that they even started calling ISIS the Islamic State, because in Syria we call them Daesh. So they gave them legitimacy, let's say, in one way or another. In my part, in 2011, I was studying Master in Political Science in Lebanon, and I just felt out of my sense of patriotism, right? I know it's something now, a lot of people think in the Western communities that it is equal to nationalism or stuff. No, it's a self of belonging to a country and your will and feelings that you want to protect this country against a foreign aggressor. So I put, although I was studying, I was writing my graduation project back then, the dissertation, I wasted no time. I joined the political activism on social media because a lot of campaigning that happened in Syria was through social media, and thankfully I learned a lot from Western activists who were also genuine in their reporting. I learned their style and their honesty also with the audience, how to respect the brain of the audience. It's very important. Lots of journalists nowadays, especially in the corporate media, they treat their audience like sheep. Like when I listen them for more than 1 minute, I already feel insulted. Like my brain feels like from inside somebody is thinking. It's so obvious. And this is what I was saying a few times. The corporate media is so powerful, but they're not creative. They have been repeating or recycling similar techniques starting from Iraq, Libya, Syria, and now in Ukraine. And I truly astonished how the people fail for the same script, just changing the names, not only once or twice or three times, multiple times. But in my opinion, the emotional mobilization, right, for the people, especially in Europe nowadays, it made people distance themselves from logic. I genuinely think that their reporting is harmful. It is harming the ordinary people. It is killing people.
Yeah.
In Aleppo, where I come from, in 2016, the reporting of the mainstream media about Al Qaeda, they were calling them moderate rebels. Al Qaeda, which they were murdering people in Aleppo based on their religion. If you don't go to prayer on Fridays, they lynch you in the streets. They decapitated 13-year-old boy in the streets, and they were proudly showing the head of that small kid in front of the public. All these horrendous crimes that you can't imagine, the media whitewashed them, and this gives Al Qaeda credibility and also political cover and media cover, and that's how they continued occupying half the city of Aleppo for 4 years. So media was complicit. They created a certain, let's say, situation in Syria, and they preserved that situation in order for the war to continue. Because at the end of the day, when you follow the media, it's so childish. They just try to tell you, oh, there is this brutal dictator, he's waking up in the morning, and he just takes up the map, and he chooses which town he has to bomb today, and bomb them with chemical weapons, right? This is it. I mean, I'm not even exaggerating. This is how they portray him. And then why they are doing that? Now in 2021, we know all the facts. We know that the CIA launched a covert operation. It was Tilbury Sycamore. It was funded up to $1 billion. This was one of the costliest CIA covert operations abroad in Syria in order to topple President Bashar al-Assad. Why? Because Bashar al-Assad and before him, his father, they had foreign policies that the United States doesn't like. It's that simple. But because the United States recently, they were trying to minimize their presence in the Middle East because they wanted to focus in Central Asia and now in Ukraine, as we see after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, they wanted to neutralize any threat that can pose against Israel. And this is the point. This war in Syria that started 11 years ago, because Syria was the only country in the Middle East still who says no to an agreement with Israel based on what Israel wants. Because at the end, there are international law, and according to the UN, the Golan Heights belong to Syria, and there are territories that belong to the Palestinians that Israel has to give up, and there are the refugees that have to go back to their country. So Syria wanted to strike a deal with Israel multiple times, but based on a just peace, not in the terms of what Israel wants. And because Israel never signed on a deal with Syria, Syria continued supporting the armed resistance against the occupation forces, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Lebanon. And we saw the consequences of that. In 2006, Syria opened all its stockpile to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and they used all the weapons Syria has in order to kick Israel again out of Lebanon in 2006. And in 2008, for the first time, the groups, militant groups in Gaza, they started using cornets. From where did they get the cornets? The Russian cornets, this from the stockpile of Syria. So Israel knows this, and therefore, in order to neutralize, as I mentioned, the this threat on Israel, they decided to destroy Syria and turn it into ashes. And what we have seen now after 11 years is pretty obvious that the regime change in its classical terms, the military terms, has failed. They couldn't topple the regime in Syria, quote unquote. Although they didn't win the war, but the Syrian side didn't win as well, because half the country is destroyed, the infrastructure is gone, the economy is below zero, the living wages, the wages are, you could cry if you if you know what are the salaries. It's like $50-$60 a month. People living in Syria because of the very high inflation and the sanctions and the destruction and no infrastructure. And now because of the sanctions, you cannot even import lots of goods. For example, the United States poses sanctions on lots of technologies and goods that if a third country, for example in the Philippines, they produce a product that consists of 10% of American technology, you cannot sell that product to Syria because of sanctions. If you're Syrian, if you want to open a bank account anywhere in the world, with dollars you cannot, because you could be suspected of being, I don't know, a terrorist or something. If you want to send anyone anything to PayPal, for example, it would be blocked. So Syrians are strangled at the moment, unfortunately, and I don't see any outrage. It's like you have 17 to 18 million people in an open air, like it's like a prison, not in the sense like they're imprisoned there, but they're detached from the outside world, and they're strangling them because they think by impoverishing the people in Syria like they did in Iraq, at the end the people will rise against the government. And but what is happening is exactly the opposite, because if there were any independent people in Syria who could have managed their expenses independently, now everyone is dependent on the government. Everybody needs the government now to secure their basic needs. Therefore, the increased dependency on the government also increases the loyalty to the government, because the people are becoming more dependent on what the government can present to them. So their sanctions are very counterproductive. They're slowly killing the Syrian people, and I don't see any outrage out there. So what I really ask for, I condemn literally killing any innocent civilian in Ukraine. However, I also expect similar sympathy with 500 million people died in Syria in the course of the regime change war, right? And before that, 500 million children in Iraq. And around 1 million Iraqis died after 2003, and millions refugees. How do you think all this happened in the region? It was very wrong foreign policy choices of the United States, and behind the United States is Israel, who was pushing Washington to pursue these destructive policies in the Middle East. Therefore, it is very important nowadays to have a multipolar world where there are other parties participating in the decision making on the international community level. So when the United States says the international community, it's so laughable. It's maybe 20 countries out of 181 or 91 countries in the world, right? So we need to include rising powers such as Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Brazil. Lots of nations should have a say in these decisions. And when we have a certain level of participation of these nations, it could decrease the chances of the United States to have the tendencies to dominate the world and therefore to go for wars. Because lots of people in the United States, this is, I think I'm paraphrasing Chomsky, that a lot of people in the United States do not know that their country is an empire, and they do not know that they do not know. You know?
Yeah.
It is so crazy how.
Well, and it's so frustrating because you have so many people who change their Twitter emoji to a Ukrainian flag, and throughout the United States they're hanging Ukrainian flags in the front yard, and yet the atrocities that have been happening in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and Yemen, I mean the list of Somalia, the list is endless. But for Western media coverage and Americans, it's been focused on Ukraine. But I think that is starting to change, you know. And I think what we try to do here on the show, at least, is to try to, to bring awareness about this hypocrisy and the money that's funneling there. You're starting to see a crack, but $40 billion last week sent to Ukraine. More is on its way, and it's going to continue for some time, and it doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon. Now, you've been covering Syria for quite a while. You talked a little bit about the $50, $60 a month, the infrastructure there crushed, a reliance now on central government. Can you give our audience a better understanding for those that don't know, that don't understand the history here? What exactly was the Western involvement in making Syria into what it is today, specifically the CIA and the Western intervention?
So it is very important to go back just 1 or 2 years before 2011 when the war erupted in Syria, the Arab Spring, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is no clear evidence whether it was planned or not. We do not know clearly if the Arab Spring was planned in the region. But the way it developed, it was pretty clear that the pro-democratic party in the United States forces, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, they were rising to power in the region. And this started to happen in Tunisia, and then in Egypt, and half of Libya, and then they started in Syria. It was a clear indication that the region under Obama and Hillary Clinton was going into what we say in Arabic, Ikhwanization. Ikhwanization means the Muslim Brotherhood in Arabic called Ikhwan al-Muslimin. So it's like trying to Islamize the entire region and make it one color, right? And this was basically meant to isolate Iran. They wanted to create a very strong force in the Arab region based on the Sunni forces, but not secular Sunni forces. Those are the Muslim Brotherhood who believe in Islamic State, but through elections. They perceive elections as some sort of a train that they can join the train and arrive to their destination. And when they arrive to their destination, they get out of the train and they start ruling it according to the Sharia laws. And this started happening in Egypt. Syria was hit by a similar wave in 2011, and it was clear from the beginning, from the slogans. The first protests that started in Syria, the Islamists were calling for shutting down mixed schools. Like, they don't want girls and boys to go together to the same school. They were asking that the veiled women, that you can't see their face, they should go back to the teaching sector, because in Syria it was banned for a woman who is covered completely to teach, because there should be human interaction with the student, right? So it was pretty clear where this is heading from day one. And then it started to develop. The Islamists started calling for extermination of the minorities. They want to send the Christians, they say, we want to send the Christians to Beirut and the Alawites to the coffins. This is a very famous slogan. So any sane person can see that this wasn't a democratic demonstrations happening in Syria, but it was portrayed by the corporate media as being democratic rebels calling for freedom and democracy. And of course, there were many enthusiastic people, also my friends and others, who thought that this could lead to a positive change in Syria. And Syria needs to be changed. Syria has to develop its political system, its parliamentary system, and should have more free press and more political participation. Everybody agrees on this. But what we don't agree is, we don't want to push the clock back, because the Islamists are regressive forces. You cannot trust an Islamist telling you they want a democratic system. No. There is democracy and Islam. They don't match. It's simple. It's like you cannot say communism and capitalism match. They are two different schools of thoughts. You cannot really fool people and say you want democracy while you're calling for Sharia laws. So the Western governments invested so heavily in these groups. They started funding them on a media level at the beginning in 2011. Lots of Facebook pages, media outlets, radio stations, TV channels. They were all created inside Syria when these areas started to get out of the control of the government. They established radio channels funded by the MI6, radio channels or TV channels, YouTube channels funded by the CIA. Also later in Turkey. in 2011, they thought that they want to create a very big demonstration against the government, that the government will crumble. But they made a miscalculation that the government has a very big supporting base too. And millions of people went to the streets in support of the government, and a lot of them not because they like the government, but because they know what the alternative is, right?
Right.
So when this chaos that they wanted to trigger in the beginning didn't work, they started funding the jihadists. And this was when the Timber Sycamore program started, which is the CIA covert operation. In 2012, the CIA started funding the jihadi groups in Syria. And when the Defense Intelligence Agency, I think in 2013, warned Barack Obama that the strongest force against Assad are the Islamists, he ignored that report. And they all knew, himself and Hillary Clinton, and the emails of Hillary Clinton also indicate that one of her aides, I think Blumenthal,
Sid Blumenthal, yeah.
yeah, I think, who sent an email that Al Qaeda is on our side in Syria. Everybody knew and understood this in Syria because there is no one in Syria who would continue fighting the government unless he is has a strong ideology. And those people are the Muslim Brotherhood, and behind them Al Qaeda, and then ISIS. So what the United States did, they created a brand called the Free Syrian Army. Those are the moderate rebels, and they said there are 80,000 moderate rebels in Syria, and there is no mechanism to count them. It's just a number stated without a source, right? But there were think tankers who were repeating this, like Charles Lister, who created a list of 80 or to 90,000 of moderate rebels in Syria, including Pashamia, who later they were decapitating children in Syria. Anyways, so it was a collusion between these think tanks and the media outlets, and behind them the CIA. And underground, there were ethnic cleansing operations happening against minorities in many places in Syria, including in Hama, in Homs, in northern Latakia, in a town called Kesab, which is an Armenian town where the Turkish-backed terrorists invaded, and they wanted to massacre the Armenians again for the second time after 100 years of the genocide against them, right? So it was a complete, comprehensive, let's say, different levels of a program, starting from the media, the political, and then the military. And when the military also didn't work, and Russia intervened, Iran intervened, Hezbollah intervened on the side of the government, now we move to the chemical weapon hysteria. And until this moment, all the chemical attacks that allegedly happened in Syria were not investigated neither carefully nor objectively. Just an example, in 2017, there was allegedly a chemical attack in Khan Sheikhoun. And what happened is, when the attack happened, allegedly, of course, Syria asked for the OPCW team to come to Syria and investigate, and they didn't send experts because they said the geography is very dangerous. Although that area is more or less was under a Turkish leverage. And who collected the samples? The white helmets. And the white helmets are established by a former MI6 security, he was an officer in the MI6.
Right.
And we all know why this organization was created. So you cannot rely on an organization that is heavily embedded with foreign intelligence agencies to collect samples for you. And I myself, I have videos for them collecting samples, and there are people walking next to the scene with sandals. They're saying there is a sarin gas attack there, and people walking there without masks and sandals, and they're asking what's wrong, because they don't know what happened. And if there was a chemical attack, a sarin chemical attack, and if we calculate the wind direction, for example, the entire town should be dead.
Right.
And not 40 people or 50 people of a sarin gas. That would never happen. And in 2018 is the same. In Duma, an alleged chemical attack happened that I think it never happened. There was no chemical attack in Duma in 2018. But the OPCW final report indicated that the cylinder that the chlorine gas came from was from a helicopter of a Syrian army that dropped that cylinder. And then the whistleblowers came from the OPCW, Ian Henderson and the rest of the team, who were on the ground in Syria and investigating, and they said clearly that the administration of the OPCW, under pressure from the United States, they took out an entire paragraphs from the final findings of the OPCW to make it look like government did this, the Syrian government did this chemical attack or alleged chemical attack there. And the engineering team can check where the cylinder can fall, and when it falls there, how should it stand, right? So they were making lots of analysis there that doesn't fit the narrative, especially when you drop a cylinder and it comes from the roof of your building and then it sits over a bed. The bed is untouched. It's like as if you threw
Sounds like 9/11.
over the bed and it stands like
Stupid,
like
weird
sleeping
shit
over
that doesn't make
over
any
the bed.
sense, but everybody
Seriously.
goes along with it.
Like, you don't need to be an expert in such cases sometimes because it's so funny and so hilarious. How can they sell that photo as an evidence for a chemical attack in Syria? In
Well,
any
we were
way,
saying,